here in the U.S.?
Well received, without doubt, and many people consider it to be his landmark foreign policy achievement of his presidency. But a lot has changed since then. Take a look at this. According to Gallup polls, by 1979, when Washington established diplomatic ties with Beijing, 64% of Americans had a favorable view of China. As of last year, that number plunged to just 20%, with close to 80% of Americans having an unfavorable view of China. In the 1970s, it was good politics for a US president or a member of Congress to support closer ties with China. Now it's bad politics for any major US politician of either party to express support for closer ties to China. And to show how much this has changed, consider this. In 2002, to mark the 20th anniversary of Nixon's trip, then President George W. Bush visited Beijing to mark the occasion. This year, Elaine, the Biden administration has no major events planned to mark this landmark trip.
Look, we've seen highs and lows, but you said it first, 50 years on, ties have changed dramatically. What would you say is driving this change, especially in recent years?
I think it comes down to the economy. Consider this. In 1972, China's economy was the 7th largest in the world, right between Canada and Italy. Now it's the world's 2nd largest economy, behind only the U.S. And many analysts say China's economy will likely surpass the U.S. by the end of the decade. Now, clearly that has alarmed people and policymakers here in the United States. But many analysts say economic competition may be good if other conflicts can be properly managed. Listen.
So I think to the extent the U.S. and China are running fast against each other, that's okay. But if it turns into real differences of approach on critical security or economic or technology issues, then it can be very unproductive and even dangerous.
It's not 1972 anymore, and one thing I've heard repeatedly from foreign policy experts is that the U.S. needs to figure out how to deal with the reality of China in 2022, a country that's strong, confident, powerful. We also hear time and again that both countries have more to gain from cooperation than from conflict. And Elaine, one more thing about that trip in 1972. It really opened up the United States to Chinese culture. The panda bears, Sing Sing and Ling Ling, arrived. I remember being a little boy here in Washington and going to visit them just a few months after this trip at the Washington Zoo. Those were the kind of things that made people really see China in a different way, to be curious about this country and to start exploring Chinese culture. And that hasn't changed, despite all of the trepidation and conflict between this relationship. I think there are still strong people-to-people ties between the U.S. and China, and that began in 1972 with that trip.
And President Nixon referred to it, or would refer to it, as the week that changed the world. Was he right? How groundbreaking was this trip?
He was right, but he was much more right than he knew. This was a week that changed the geopolitical arrangements in the world. China and the United States, which had had no substantive relationship, now developed one. This set in motion a process that none of us anticipated, and which culminated at the end of the decade in 1978 at the third plenum of the 11th Party Congress, when Deng Xiaoping opened a reform and opening process which depended on the relationship with the United States. And in the 1980s, 90s, and thereafter, China has continued to change at a remarkable pace. And one can trace this actually to the Nixon-Mao Zedong meetings in 1972.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Elaine. For one thing, it's a game. It is meant to be fun, inoffensive, and ultimately, it doesn't matter. Also, when people play sports, everyone, no matter where they are in the world or what country they come from, they all agree to play by the same set of rules. The most notable example and most recent example, of course, is the Beijing Olympics. But most importantly, sport fosters people-to-people relations, which can be a very powerful force when it comes to breaking down cultural barriers and dispelling stereotypes. And one of the most famous examples of that, as you mentioned, is ping pong diplomacy, when a chance encounter on a bus at the 1971 World Table Tennis Championships put the first cracks in what was a very, very frosty China-U.S. relationship. That friendly exchange between American Glenn Cowan and the Chinese team captain was really able to disarm the public and politicians in a way that traditional diplomacy simply could not at the height of the Cold War. And of course, this led to that historic 1972 visit by US President Richard Nixon to China and the eventual normalization of diplomatic relations. Now, you may remember that I was at the last World Table Tennis Championships in Houston this past November, where I spoke to Neil Bush. He is the son of the former US President George H.W. Bush, who was in fact an ambassador to China unofficially in the 1970s. And Neil told me how that experience shaped the rest of his father's political career. Take a listen.
You know, he welcomed the Chinese, and he's had a very kind of deep personal relationship with Chinese leaders, but also Chinese people. And because he lived in China for 15 months and experienced it firsthand and had lots of interactions with Chinese over his political and then later in life, you know, he understood the nuance of culture and the political differences, and he understood you don't have to have the same culture and political system in order to work together to solve problems. So, yeah, he was a real advocate for, and I think gets a lot of credit for, you know, how the United States has benefited over the years from our bilateral ties with China.
So a very important lesson there when it comes to working together despite differences, something that many people hope that China and the United States are going to be able to continue to do if they're going to be able to tackle some of the most pressing issues facing the world right now, most notably climate change.